We've spent a lot of time thinking about your argument for this speech, your persuasive argument. What I would like to do now is just talk a little bit about fallacies. Fallacies are flawed arguments, and in this segment I want to talk about fallacies of claims and data. So in that sense, we're back to these key notions of claim, data, warrant. All the stuff that we were talking about way back in the impromptu speech. And fallacy, comes from the Latin that means trick or deceit. My concern with fallacies is twofold. One, you should avoid fallacies, and you should avoid committing fallacies. I call these fallacies on the page. You should avoid writing a flawed argument. And that's a chief concern, and you can take lots of philosophy classes, logic classes that are concerned with avoiding performing a fallacy. As speakers, we've got an additional concern. Not only should you avoid fallacies, but you should avoid sounding like you're committing a fallacy. So not only should you avoid fallacies on the page, you should make sure that your audiences understand that you're not engaging in flawed reasoning. That's a higher bar. That requires you to think more through the ears of your audience and how they're going to interpret what you say. So I want to talk a little bit about these fallacies and how you can avoid them and what you want to be doing to make sure that your audience knows that you've got a good argument. So like I said, we're going to be talking about fallacies of claims and data. So let's begin with a fallacy of a claim, a false dilemma. A false dilemma is simply reducing a complex issue to two issues. And I've got a sample text here that I'm going to read to you. I've used this sample text for years. I went ahead and looked on it so I could make the proper attribution, and I plugged in this quotation, and like every fallacy website online uses this quotation. I don't know where it started from, but this is usually popular. But it's a good illustration of a false dilemma. So it's from a book called Hostages to Fortune. Gerda Reith is convinced that superstition can be a positive force. It gives you a sense of control by making you think you can work out what's going to happen next, she says. And so it also makes you feel lucky. And to take a risk or to enter into a chancy situation, you really have to believe in your own luck. In that sense, it's a very useful way of thinking because the alternative is fatalism, which is to say, oh, there's nothing I can do. At least superstition makes people do things. All right, well, that's a false dilemma. The opposite of superstition is not fatalism. It's not those two choices. It's not either I am superstition, either I'm going to, cast lots in order to determine what the day looks like, or that's it, I'm committing suicide. Those are not the two options that we are presented with in this life. The opposite of anything of superstition would be not superstition, presence, absence. So this is creating only two options where there are multiple options around. Okay? And to do so is to minimize unnecessarily your argument, the range of possible actions to only two. So that's one fallacy of claim. Another fallacy of claim is begging the question, which would be simply supporting a claim with the claim itself slightly restated. So the famous example of this is, since I'm not lying, I'm clearly telling the truth. Those are both the same claims. There's nothing outside of the claim, right? The nice thing about a claim and data is you've got the claim and then you've got something exterior to the claim, something separate from the claim that we can use to validate that claim or to prove that claim. With begging the question, you have the claim, and then you swap it around. You have it put on a silly hat and a fake mustache. Aha! No, it's still not data. It's still just the claim. Okay? So begging the question, you're not providing enough of a break between the claim and the data. Once again, either with false dilemma or with begging the question, if you're looking at your argument and you know a oppositional audience member might hear that piece of your speech as begging the question or as one of these, you want to go out of your way to demonstrate, in this case, why the data is separate from the claim. Talk through why you're not actually begging the question. Another fallacy of claim would be slippery slope reasoning. So in slippery slope reasoning, one event leads to another, to another, to another, without the necessary logical connections. So, we hear these arguments a lot in terms of development. So if we improve this highway, it will lead to urban sprawl and the absolute destruction of our local environment. Well, pump your brakes there, Chief, because you went from 0 to 60 pretty doggone fast. Each one of those probably requires separate proof. If we improve this highway, it will lead to urban sprawl. that's an issue that demands demonstration, that demands evidence. You can't simply assume that and immediately jump on to the next claim. Here is really important because for you, the argument that you're making, you may see and understand these logical connections. But if that target audience doesn't see and hear those logical connections, they could assume you're engaging in slippery slope reasoning. So be very careful to make sure that you're proving your argument, that you're not assuming too much. Because the goal is not to convince you. You're already on your own side, I would imagine, unless you're a self-loathing persuader. I assume you're on your own side. Your goal is to think through how that audience is going to hear it, and they may not see that logical connection, so you need to prove it for them. So those are some fallacies of claims. Then we get into fallacies of data. So here, is there something flawed about the data source and its relationship to the claim? So an ad populum. An ad populum is appealing to popular support as the sole basis for support, and especially sole basis when it would be the inappropriate basis for support. So hypothetically, you could say, millions of gamers, computer gamers bought the Wii, therefore it is the best system around. Well, best system around is a value claim, and you're using merely a numerical claim to back that up. So popular support for the thing doesn't mean it's the best. You'd have to identify what constitutes best graphics, best whatever. You could have popular support without being a fallacy if you said the Wii is the best-selling system around, and it's the best-selling because it was bought by the most people. That's clear. That's not a flawed argument, but it's because the claim and the data are logical connections for one another. So ad populum is where there's that sort of slippage, there's that missing piece, where popular support isn't really what you needed in order to prove that claim. And I want to end this small lecture with another fallacy of data, a red herring. So in a red herring, what we're saying is that you're raising irrelevant data to distract, right? The etymology, the hypothetical, perhaps etymology of this term is that back when people, the rich landowners engaged in fox hunts across the British countryside. They'd be riding their horses. The dogs would be chasing a fox, and the fox would run through somebody's field of oats. I don't know what they grow. So it'd run through their field, and then the fox would run into the field. The dogs would run through the field. The men on the horses would come through and trample down the field. And so the farmers, so the story goes, would drag a herring or some other really smelly fish around the edge of their field. So the fox would run through the field, and then the dogs would smell the fish, and they'd be all confused. That's what a red herring fallacy is supposedly doing. It's throwing you off the scent of the claim. You're listening to the speech, and then the data comes up. Confused. What were you talking about? I'm convinced. So a red herring is irrelevant data raised in order to distract the listener from the argument. And I'm going to have you watch at the end of this video on the page. There's a YouTube video of. It's on the page. It's not in this lecture clip. A clip of Nixon's checker speech. So this is often claimed as a red herring. Just a little bit of background if you're unfamiliar with it. After his 1950 election to the Senate, or after his 1950 election, Nixon had a special fund set up to support further campaign efforts. And this ended up with a travel allowance for Nixon. So when Nixon ran as vice president on the Eisenhower ticket in 1952, this fund came back, and it was reported on as being ethically dubious. And so this has often been critiqued as being a red herring issue, because what he does is he goes through and he gives himself an audit, and then at the end of his speech, and television is very much in its infancy here, at the end of the speech he says, now people have critiqued me for a number of reasons, but we received a dog as a gift, and I've got 2 little girls and they love the dog, but I am not going to give back the dog. No one was saying that he should give back dogs. They were talking about campaign funds and misattribution and ethically dubious behavior. This was well before Watergate, but that was the issue, is that some saw that piece of evidence as an overly maudlin attempt to distract from the key issue of inappropriate use of funds. So you can go ahead and take a look at this clip as this small segment, as this performance of what some have critiqued it as being a red herring.